COP16 is over, sort of. So what happened? Hi, and welcome to Sustainability Takes New Zealand, a YouTube channel created primarily for New Zealanders to highlight news, events, developments, plans, and ideas related to all things sustainable. Today's topic is COP16, the 2024 Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a bit of a mouthful. Perhaps you can see why we simply call it COP16. Some of you may have also heard that COP29 has started, and you may be wondering, how do we get from 16 to 29 in 1 week? Well, turns out there are two separate sets of conferences. Just a note here, if you already know the history, you can skip ahead. Way back at the beginning, and that was in 1992, the UN established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. As we'll quickly see, the UN has a tendency to create groups and programs with long, cumbersome names and then tack on an acronym. In general, we'll be using those acronyms. The UNFCCC has a very straightforward goal to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. The ultimate objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, that's human-induced, interference with the climate system. They want to accomplish this at such a level and within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. It turns out these are really challenging goals. The first meeting where countries got together to actually work on this was at 1995 COP1 in Berlin. Not too surprisingly, the main outcomes were to agree that a general reduction in GHGs was good and have more meetings. Actually, given there were at least 117 different perspectives on this issue, that really wasn't a bad outcome. Progress has been a bit inconsistent over the years, and sadly, most meetings didn't really accomplish a great deal. Not really surprising, these conferences struggle to reach any sort of agreement. With somewhere between 150 and 200 delegates, all with their own agendas, the phrase herding cats comes to mind. There were a few notable examples, though. COP3 in Kyoto in 1997 resulted in the Kyoto Protocol that set the first real targets for this. It actually took until COP11 in 2005, to get the protocol in force. At COP21 in Paris, 2015, a legally binding treaty was finally negotiated. Targets and financing were put in place, and a transparent flow of information was mandated. Without going into all of the rather complex negotiations and discussions, much of the rest of the COPs have been about adding detail to the goals and objectives of Paris. It wasn't until COP26 in 2021 that the Paris rulebook was actually finalized. Two main points seem to predominate the discussions: the different roles for developing versus developed countries, and who was going to be paying for this. Now, alongside this stream, the UN created a separate entity, the Convention on Biological Diversity. The acronym is CBD. The first COP was held in Nassau in 1994. Its main objectives were the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Now, these conferences have not been held as regularly as the UNFCCC conferences, so after 30 years, we're only up to COP16. Part of this delay is also due to having extraordinary meetings, in the most recent case dealing with budgets, and having meetings run so long they had to be broken into two separate sessions. They also decided to have their meetings every 2 years, not annually. So two separate streams, the climate change conferences, now up to COP29, and the biological diversity stream, COP16. So let's get stuck into the CBD COP16. The conference started on 21 October in Cali, Colombia, and was built on the foundation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted at COP15 in 2022. Not too bad, 28 years, 15 conferences to get to this point. This framework is pretty extensive, though. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but the short version is 4 overarching goals and 23 specific targets. Now, I've summarized the 4 goals as Goal A. By 2050, restore ecosystems, halt human-induced extinctions, reduce extinction risk tenfold, increase native species abundance, and preserve genetic diversity in wild and domesticated species. Goal B. By 2050, sustainably manage biodiversity and ecosystem services, halt declines, and enhance their contribution to sustainable development for current and future generations. Goal C. By 2050, fairly share benefits from genetic resources, digital sequences, and traditional knowledge, ensuring their protection and supporting biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And Goal D. Secure equitable financial resources, capacity building, technology, and cooperation for implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework, closing the biodiversity finance gap, and aligning with the 2050 biodiversity goals. Beyond this, for COP16, participating countries were expected to show the alignment of their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, NPSAPs, with the framework and present progress on monitoring and resourcing mobilization of the framework. So, how did they do? To be honest, not great. Let's tackle the action plan progress first. The latest count is only 30 of the 192 parties have actually submitted revised plans. To be somewhat fair, it's been slightly less than 2 years since the framework was adopted. And on government time, that's not very long. In New Zealand is one of the countries that has not submitted a revised plan. Not too surprising, given the change in government and all. We do have one, though. The unanswered question is it fit for purpose? The plan was created back in 2020, pre-Kunming Montreal Global Framework. Like many such documents, it's quite big on policy and overall strategy. It has a strong recognition of traditional Maori values, the unique nature of a considerable portion of New Zealand plants and wildlife, and links to just about every international body or agreement that relates to this space. It presents 5 outcomes for measuring progress on the strategy. Number 1, ecosystems from mountaintops to ocean depths are thriving. Number 2, indigenous species and their habitats across Aotearoa, New Zealand and beyond are thriving. Number 3, people's lives are enriched through their connection with nature. Number 4, Maori are exercising their full role. Number 5, prosperity is intrinsically linked with a thriving biodiversity. As a first take on the current state of affairs, the helpful folks over at Science Media Center asked 6 experts in the biodiversity space for their opinions and comments on the New Zealand plan and our failure to submit a revised version to COP16. If you're keen to see the full text of the article, it's on the Science Media Center webpage, along with a whole bunch of other really interesting pieces. There are 2 themes that stand out from these interviews. Number 1, disappointment and missed opportunities in meeting global biodiversity targets, coupled with the need for a stronger governmental support for biodiversity initiatives. In other words, we've not done anywhere near enough in meeting our targets and missed a golden opportunity to demonstrate leadership in this area. Given New Zealand's rather unique position as a biodiversity hotspot, failing to submit a revised plan stands out as a missed opportunity to demonstrate leadership in biodiversity protection. Several of the experts also commented on the lack of urgency of action in this space, with the increasing risks and threats to biodiversity loss. This is generally ascribed to the government not adequately supporting efforts in this area. The belief is that New Zealand's biodiversity protection sector is underfunded and under-resourced. The interviewees called for better coordination between government policies, conservation efforts, and international commitments to ensure New Zealand can effectively address biodiversity challenges. And number 2, conflict between domestic policies and international biodiversity commitments. Points were raised related to the contradictions between New Zealand's international commitments and its domestic policies, with concerns over government decisions that undermine biodiversity protection. Issues such as support for environmentally harmful industries and changes to key environmental policies were noted. These decisions conflict with the principles of the CBD and the country's biodiversity strategy. This lack of alignment is seen as a key challenge to meaningful biodiversity protection in New Zealand. The second observation is an interesting one. Our plan does set out 51 potential indicators as measures of success for the outcomes. But as with many efforts that are policy documents at heart, not all of these indicators are actually measurable. There are some pretty straightforward indicators that could potentially be measured, things like the demography of widespread animal species, the state of fish stocks, bird species on public conservation land, indigenous species in urban and developed spaces, Maori culture and intellectual property agreements in relation to biodiversity, and carbon sequestration from native forests all have potential to be effectively measured. But equally, there are indicators for which measurement is at the very least problematic. For example, developing the useful measures of concepts such as protection in the marine environment, indigenous cover and protection in land environments, and customary use of biodiversity is going to be a serious challenge. Finally, there are some indicators whose link to biodiversity seems, well, tenuous at best. Connection with nature in children and adults, number of people spending time in nature, and intergenerational transmission of te reo in households, Maori communities may all be really desirable social outcomes, but their impact on improving biodiversity is not always obvious or, perhaps more to the point, measurable. The second observation is a bit more serious. There are some questions as to whether our plan is well aligned with the CBD or our own internal actions. Now, I'll be really clear about this. I do not think we should be constrained to just following the CBD guidelines. I think New Zealand, and indeed every other participant, should be free to create a plan that meets our local needs. But I also think the CBD goals should figure prominently in that plan. It's not obvious that that's the case. I think in some cases we're in good shape on goals A and B, especially related to restoring and managing ecosystems, although calls for greater and faster progress are not out of line. There are some questions that remain that our plan does not directly address, specifically related to restoration, pollution reduction, biotechnology, and disclosure. The new government has some work to do in clarifying key points in these areas. Unfortunately, I'm not sure we're doing well on Goal C, related to intellectual property, or Goal D, paying for this. Interestingly enough, these last two were also the biggest issues at COP16. After years of discussion, a digital sequence information fund was established that calls for commercial organizations to contribute a portion of their profits from products that use genetic information from nature. This fund will support indigenous communities and developing countries. It's important to note quite a bit of the detail on how this will work has yet to be resolved. The New Zealand plan is effectively silent on this matter. The other major issue concerned representation and funding. Now, there's good news, bad news element to this. The good news is indigenous communities have been granted a permanent role in the decision-making process. Up until now, they were informal working groups that pretty much were at the mercy of recognized governments, but no more. By comparison, we put a great deal of effort into this aspect of our plan. But overall, this issue is reflective of the particular CBD focus on indigenous communities in the biodiversity discussion. By comparison, the UNFCCC, that's the climate change stream, focuses on developing nations. To a certain extent, they're really talking about the same thing. Developed nations, who tend to have smaller, marginalized indigenous populations, not only contribute disproportionately to climate biological diversity problems, but enjoy the benefits of any profits derived from their actions. The developing countries, typically with significant identifiable indigenous populations, bear a disproportionate share of the problems created and lack the economic wherewithal to adequately address the issues. So in both streams, funding the developing indigenous parties is a critical matter. The bad news portion of this is that COP16 made no real progress in this area. The objective of the 2020 plan was to raise $200 billion by 2030, and that got nowhere. I think it's fair to say that in New Zealand, we lack clarity as to how activities related to addressing biodiversity are going to be funded. This was clearly highlighted by the experts in the interviews we mentioned above. Finally, the CBD folks have essentially the same problem as New Zealand when it comes to actually measuring progress. They still have no real system in place for measuring or tracking progress on the 4 goals or 23 targets set at COP15. Nor is it clear how we will be measuring and tracking the 51 potential indicators in our plan. To kind of wrap up the comparison, my admittedly subjective assessment of the alignment between the KM framework and the New Zealand plan is that we address to some extent about half of the framework targets. And as is becoming a bit of a regular occurrence for this conference, there were so many undecided issues at COP16 that an interim meeting, essentially COP16 Part 2, will be held in 2025. I'm left with essentially the same feeling about New Zealand's biodiversity plan. There is still a great deal of work to be done. I'm hoping 2025 will bring some serious action in this space. Thank you for listening to the channel. I'll be posting more in the very near future, so please check back. I'm always looking for feedback, so please feel free to comment and hit the subscribe button. It's the clearest indication I have that viewers are appreciating what I have to offer. Thanks again.